If you've ever felt like history left a few things out, you're probably right. You're listening to Made for Sleep, where history unfolds slowly and without urgency. Tonight, we explore Celtic conspiracies that were actually true, not as secret plots, but as quiet knowledge passed by firelight, memory, and careful tradition. Let the flames settle and the story wander. And if you'd like, let me know how you're doing in the comments and what time it is where you're listening from. There is a kind of silence that only exists before the world starts writing things down. Not the silence of emptiness, not the silence of nothing happening. It is the silence of everything happening quietly, without leaving a mark on paper. It is the silence of 1,000 generations of people who lived full lives, built communities, loved each other, argued about the weather, buried their dead, and celebrated the return of spring, all of which left almost no written record. This is where our story begins, not with a dramatic event, not with a war or a conquest or the fall of a great city. It begins with that silence, with the long, slow, unhurried stretch of time before someone decided that thoughts needed to be pinned down with ink. And here is the thing that most people do not realise, the thing that makes this entire story so quietly extraordinary, that silence was not an accident. It was not a failure. It was not a sign that these people had nothing worth saying. It was a choice. A deliberate, careful, deeply considered choice made by some of the most thoughtful people who ever lived on this earth. And once you understand why they made that choice, once you truly sit with the reasoning behind it, the entire history of the ancient Celts begins to look less like a mystery and more like something that was always there, waiting to be understood on its terms rather than on ours. So settle in. Let the night come around you. Let the sounds of the world outside grow quiet and distant. We're going to move through this story slowly, the way these ancient people themselves moved through the world, with attention, with care, and with a great deal of patience. Imagine the landscape of Europe roughly 2,500 years ago. Not the Europe of highways and city grids and satellite maps, but the older Europe. The Europe of dense forest and open meadow, of rivers that had not yet been dammed or straightened, of hills that rose and fell in long, unbroken waves of green. The air was different then, cleaner in ways we can barely comprehend now. The stars at night were a blaze of white across a sky that no electric light had ever interrupted. The people who lived across this landscape, stretching from what we now call Ireland all the way east, to the plains of modern-day Turkey and south into the warmth of the Iberian Peninsula, were not one single nation. They did not call themselves Celts. That word came later, applied by Greek and Roman writers who were trying to make sense of peoples they did not fully understand. But these scattered communities shared something remarkable. They shared a way of seeing the world, a common thread of language, of belief, and of social organisation tied them together across thousands of miles of varied terrain. And the first thing you need to understand about them, the very first thing, is that they were not backward. They were not primitive. They were not a lesser version of the Greeks and Romans who wrote about them. They were simply different, profoundly, intentionally different. And that difference is at the heart of everything we're going to talk about tonight. The Greeks and Romans, for all their extraordinary achievements in philosophy and engineering and law, were cultures that believed in writing things down. They believed that knowledge lived on paper, that if something was not recorded, it was somehow less real, less permanent, and less worthy of being remembered. This was their lens, and it was the lens through which they looked at every other civilization they encountered. When they looked at the Celts, they saw a people with no books, no written histories, no libraries. And through their particular lens, this looked like absence. It looked like lack. It looked like people who had nothing to say or who had not yet figured out how to say it. But what if it was the opposite? What if the Celts looked at the Greek and Roman obsession with writing and saw something dangerous, something that could weaken the mind rather than strengthen it? What if their silence, their beautiful and deliberate silence, was actually one of the most sophisticated intellectual decisions any ancient civilization ever made? Let us sit with that idea for a moment. Let it settle. Close your eyes for a moment if you like. Not to sleep, not yet, but simply to imagine what it would have felt like to live in a world without books, without newspapers, without the constant murmur of written language surrounding you at every turn. A world where the only way to learn something was to find someone who already knew it, and to sit with them, and to listen. A world where knowledge had a voice, a breath, and a warmth, where it could only be given from one living person to another, the way a flame can only be passed from one candle to the next. That world was not so long ago, in the deep measure of human time. And for the Celts, it was not simply the world they happened to live in. It was the world they actively chose to preserve. The Greeks had a word for it. They called the Celts' way of passing knowledge through spoken language and memorized verse and oral tradition. And they recorded this, because of course they did, with a mixture of fascination and something close to bemusement. The historian Strabo wrote about Celtic scholars who spent years, sometimes as many as 19 years, in a state of study that was almost monastic in its dedication. Julius Caesar himself, in his accounts of his campaigns in what is now France, noted that the Celtic priests, the people we have come to call Druids, refused to commit their teachings to writing even though they were perfectly capable of it. This is a crucial detail. Caesar did not say the Celts could not write. He said they chose not to. There is a world of difference between those two statements, and most people, when they first encounter this history, gloss right past it. So why? Why would an intelligent, sophisticated people deliberately refuse to write down their most important knowledge? The answer, when you begin to piece it together from the scattered references left by Greek and Roman writers, and from the archaeological evidence, and from the deep wells of Celtic myth and poetry that survived in Ireland and Wales in later centuries, is both practical and philosophical. It touches on questions about how memory works, about the relationship between a person and the land they live on, and about what happens to knowledge when you remove it from the living context in which it was meant to exist. The first reason was about the nature of memory itself. The Celts, and many other cultures around the world who practiced oral tradition, understood something about the human mind that modern neuroscience is only now beginning to confirm. They understood that knowledge that is memorized through repetition, through rhythm, through song, or through story is not stored the same way as knowledge that is simply read from a page. Memorized knowledge becomes part of you. It lives in your body as much as it lives in your mind. It is connected to emotion, to breath, and to the act of speaking aloud to another person. It is alive in a way that words on a page are not. When a Celtic scholar spent 19 years memorizing the teachings of their tradition, they were not simply filling up a mental library. They were transforming themselves. The knowledge was becoming woven into the fabric of their consciousness, inseparable from who they were. And this meant that every time the knowledge was passed on from teacher to student, from elder to young person, from one generation to the next, it was not a copying process. It was a living transmission, a conversation, a relationship. The poetry of the ancient Celts deserves a moment of its own, because it was not simply a form of entertainment or even a form of cultural preservation. It was, in a very real sense, a technology, a sophisticated, carefully developed set of techniques for encoding information in a form that the human memory could hold onto across generations without losing its essential content. Celtic verse forms were extraordinarily complex. The Irish poets, the Fillid, as they were called, were required to master dozens of different meter patterns before they were considered fully trained. These patterns were not arbitrary. They were designed to work with the way the human mind naturally processes and retains rhythmic information. A piece of knowledge encoded in a particular meter, sung or chanted to a particular melody, and repeated at regular intervals over the course of years. That knowledge would take root in the memory in a way that a simple statement of fact never could. Think of how easily you remember a song you heard as a child, how the words come back to you, decades later, unbidden, triggered by a particular melody or a particular rhythm. The Celts understood this capacity of the human mind, and they built their entire system of knowledge transmission around it. The great poems, the origin myths, the genealogies, the histories of the gods and the heroes were not simply stories told for pleasure. They were repositories. Living libraries were carried in the minds of the poets who had memorized them and passed on, intact, from one generation of poets to the next. The discipline required to become a Celtic poet was immense. The training lasted years. Some accounts say as many as 12 or even 20 years of intensive study. The student learned not only the verse forms and the melodies, but also the entire body of knowledge that the poems contained. Geography, history, law, genealogy, the names and deeds of every significant figure in the community's past, the relationships between places and people and events that gave meaning to the present, all of it woven into verse, carried in memory, ready to be spoken aloud when the occasion demanded it. This was not a lesser form of intellectual achievement than writing. It was a different form, and in some ways, in the way it demanded total engagement, in the way it kept knowledge alive and responsive to the community that used it, and in the way it maintained a living relationship between the knowledge and the people who carried it, it was arguably a more powerful form. A book can be ignored, a poem that lives in a poet's memory, that will be spoken aloud at the next gathering, that the entire community expects to hear, that knowledge cannot be set aside. It must be attended to. It must be received. Write something down, and it becomes a thing you can point to. A fixed object. Something that can be copied, carried away, stripped of its context, and misunderstood by someone who was never meant to receive it. Keep it in memory. Keep it alive through the act of telling and listening, and it remains tethered to the people and the places and the relationships that gave it meaning. This was not a small consideration. For cultures whose entire worldview was built around the idea that the land, the seasons, the community, and the individual were all part of one continuous breathing system, the idea of knowledge floating free, disconnected from all of that, pinned to a piece of parchment like a butterfly pinned to a board, that would have seemed not just strange but almost violent. And this brings us to the landscapes. If you could fly over ancient Celtic territory in the early morning light, let us say sometime around 500 BCE, when their influence stretched widest across the continent, you would notice something. You would notice that the places where these communities built their most important gathering sites, their sacred spaces, and their places of ceremony and council were not chosen randomly. They were not simply wherever it was convenient to build. They were chosen with extraordinary care, and the criteria for that choice had almost nothing to do with military strategy or trade routes. The Celts chose their sacred landscapes the way a musician chooses a resonant room. They listened to the land. There are places in the world where something seems to happen to the quality of your attention, where the light falls in a particular way, or where the land curves into a shape that makes you stop walking and simply stand there breathing, where water moves over stone in a way that sounds almost like language, where the boundary between sky and earth seems thinner than it does anywhere else. The Celts were extraordinarily sensitive to these places. They found them, and they marked them, and they returned to them generation after generation. Many of these places share certain physical characteristics. They tend to be at points where different landscapes meet, where a forest gives way to open water, where a hilltop drops suddenly into a valley, or where a river bends sharply and creates an island or a peninsula. These are liminal places, threshold places, places where one world seems to bleed into another, and the Celts understood, or perhaps more accurately the Celts felt, that these transitions in the landscape were meaningful, that they corresponded to something real about the nature of the world. The bogs were particularly important, across Ireland, Scotland, Britain, and into the heartlands of continental Celtic territory in France and Germany. The great peat bogs were treated as sacred ground, and not sacred in the way we might casually use that word today, meaning simply important or impressive. Sacred in the sense that they were understood to be a place where the boundary between the living world and whatever lay beyond it became extraordinarily thin. Think about what a bog actually is if you've never stood at the edge of one in the early morning when the mist is sitting low on the water. It is a landscape that is neither land nor water. It is solid enough to walk on, but only just. Beneath your feet, the ground is a sponge of decomposed plant matter and dark, tea-coloured water that stretches down into depths you cannot see. The surface moves when you step on it. It trembles. Things that fall into a bog do not disappear. They are preserved. Extraordinarily well preserved, in fact, sometimes for thousands of years. The bog holds what is given to it. The bog bodies themselves, and there are hundreds of them found across Ireland, Britain, Denmark, Germany and the Netherlands, are among the most haunting and most informative artefacts the ancient world has left behind. Preserved by the acidic, oxygen-poor conditions of the peat, some of them are so well preserved that you can see the texture of their skin, the contents of their last meal, and the calluses on their hands from years of work. They are, in a sense, the closest we can come to looking at an ancient Celtic person face to face. For decades, the popular narrative surrounding bog bodies focused on violence. Many of them show signs of brutal treatment, stab wounds, broken bones, and ligature marks around the neck. This led to dramatic theories about ritual sacrifice, about offerings to the gods, and about the dark and bloody side of Celtic religion that the Romans had warned us about. And the Romans, of course, were only too happy to have their accounts seemingly confirmed. But more recent scholarship has complicated this picture enormously. Many bog bodies show no signs of violence at all. They are simply people who died, from illness, from accident, from the ordinary causes that have always ended human lives, and whose bodies were placed in the bog with care, with attention, sometimes with grave goods, a cloak, a knife, a piece of food, sometimes with injuries that appear to have been treated and healed over, before death came from some other cause entirely. And even the violent deaths, when examined more carefully, do not always support the narrative of brutal ritual killing. Some scholars have suggested that bog bodies may represent a complex range of burial practices, some honourable, some punitive, some somewhere in between, that reflect the full spectrum of how a Celtic community dealt with its dead. The bog was not simply a place of sacrifice. It was a place of transition, a place where the dead were given to the land, returned to the earth in a way that acknowledged the cycle of decay and renewal that the bog itself so perfectly represented. To stand at the edge of a bog and to think about what lies beneath the surface, the layers of compressed vegetation, the slow accumulation of centuries, the bodies and the offerings and the memories of all the people who came here to give something back to the land, is to stand at one of the most profound interfaces between human life and the natural world that exists anywhere on earth. The bog does not judge. It does not distinguish between the honourable dead and the dishonoured. It simply receives. It simply preserves. It holds what is given to it, and it holds it gently, and it holds it for as long as it needs to. The Celts knew this, and they gave the dogs many things. Weapons, yes, and sometimes bodies. Though the violence sometimes attributed to bog bodies is far more complicated than popular accounts suggest, and we'll come back to that. But also treasures, gold torques and intricate bronze work and beautifully crafted cauldrons that represented enormous wealth and skill. These were not things discarded or lost. They were offerings, gifts given to a place that was understood to exist between worlds. And here is where the conspiracy begins to reveal itself, not as something sinister, but as something quietly magnificent. Because the Romans, when they encountered these sacred landscapes, did not understand them. They could not understand them. Not really, because their entire framework for thinking about the world did not include the possibility that a landscape could be sacred in itself, independent of any god or temple built upon it. The Romans built temples, they placed statues, they imposed their gods onto the land like stamps pressed into wax. The idea that the land itself might already be holy, might already possess a kind of consciousness or significance that predated any human religion. That was a foreign concept. And so when Roman writers described Celtic sacred sites, they described them in Roman terms. They saw ritual, and they called it superstition. They saw reverence, and they called it fear. They saw a complex, nuanced relationship between a people and their landscape, and they simplified it into something they could fit into their own understanding. And the simplification stuck. For centuries, for well over 1,000 years, the story of the Celts was told through Roman eyes. Their sacred landscapes became primitive ritual grounds. Their careful, deliberate relationship with the land became barbaric nature worship. Their silence, their beautiful oral tradition, became evidence of backwardness. But the landscape itself did not change. The bogs are still there. The hilltops are still there. The places where water meets stone in that particular way, where the light does that particular thing in the early morning, those places are still there, and they still do something to the people who visit them. They still make you stop. They still make you breathe a little deeper. They still feel, to anyone who is paying attention, like a place where something important is happening, just below the surface of what you can see. Let the night settle a little deeper around you now. We are moving into the quieter heart of this story. Power. Let us talk about power, because this is where another one of the great Celtic conspiracies, another one of the things that Roman writers got so fundamentally wrong, truly comes into focus. When most people think about ancient societies, they think about kings. They think about pyramids of authority, with one person at the top and everyone else below. This is such a deeply ingrained assumption in Western thinking that we often project it onto cultures where it did not actually exist. We assume that every ancient society had a single ruler, a supreme leader, someone who held all the power and made all the decisions. And when we look at the Celts, we look for that person. We look for the king, the chief, the supreme authority. But the picture that emerges when you look carefully at the evidence, not just the Roman accounts, but the Irish and Welsh myths that preserve so much of Celtic social structure, and the archaeological record of how Celtic communities actually lived, the picture is much more interesting than a simple hierarchy. Much more interesting and much more subtle. Celtic society was, in many ways, a society built on negotiation, on consensus, on a web of relationships and obligations that distributed power so thoroughly that no single person could ever accumulate too much of it without the whole web beginning to vibrate in protest. The Irish myths, and these myths, though written down in the early medieval period by Christian monks, preserve remarkably detailed information about pre-Christian Irish social customs, are full of kings who are not really kings in the way we understand the word. They are figures who hold a particular role, yes, but that role is bounded by obligations so extensive and so carefully defined that it functions almost as much as a form of service as it does as a form of authority. There is the concept of the sacred king, the king whose personal well-being is tied to the prosperity of the land. If the king is virtuous, the crops grow well. If the king fails in his duties, the land itself begins to wither. This is not simply a metaphor in the myths. It is presented as a literal physical truth. The king is not above the land. He is part of it. His power does not come from conquest or wealth or military force. It comes from his relationship with the earth, and that relationship can be broken. And there are rules, so many rules. The Irish myths are full of what are called geasa, singular gaze, which are essentially sacred prohibitions placed on individuals, often on kings. A king might be forbidden from eating a particular food, or from travelling in a particular direction on a particular day, or from refusing hospitality to a stranger. These prohibitions might seem arbitrary to a modern reader, but they functioned as a kind of check on power. They reminded the person who held authority that their authority was conditional, that it could be taken away, that they were answerable not just to their community, but to the land itself, and to the deep, old, invisible forces that the land represented. This is not the picture of power that the Romans painted. The Romans saw Celtic warriors and Celtic leaders, and they saw something that looked, to Roman eyes, like a familiar structure, a chieftain with warriors beneath him, like a ruffer, less civilized version of a Roman general. They did not see, or if they saw, they did not understand, the vast invisible architecture of obligation and reciprocity and sacred duty that actually held Celtic society together. And because the Romans did not see it, they did not write about it. And because they did not write about it, it disappeared from the historical record. For centuries, the Celtic world looked, to anyone reading the available sources, like a collection of warlike tribes ruled by ambitious chieftains, simple, brutal, easily understood through a Roman lens. But the myths survived, passed down at first through exactly the kind of oral tradition the Celts had always relied on, and then eventually written down by monks in Ireland who were trying to preserve something they sensed was valuable, even if they no longer fully understood its original context. And when scholars began to read those myths carefully, really carefully, paying attention not just to the dramatic stories but to the social details embedded within them, they began to see the shape of a society that was far more sophisticated, far more thoughtful in its organisation than anyone had given it credit for. Power, shared, not hoarded, not concentrated, distributed through a web of relationships so intricate and so carefully maintained that it looked, from the outside, almost invisible, almost like no one was in charge at all. But everyone was. Everyone, in their own way, in their own sphere, held a piece of it, and the system worked, quietly, sustainably, without the constant upheaval that comes when power is held by too few hands. Now, the Romans. We cannot tell this story without spending some time with the Romans, because it was the Romans who did more than anyone else to shape the way we think about the Celts. And what they did, unintentionally for the most part, was to replace a complex, layered reality with a much simpler story. A story that served Roman purposes, even if those purposes were not always consciously articulated. Julius Caesar invaded what is now France, which the Romans called Gaul, in 58 BCE. It was an extraordinarily bloody campaign, and the Romans won, and when it was over, Caesar wrote about it. His writings, the Gallic Wars, are one of our primary sources for understanding the Celts of that era. And they are fascinating documents, partly because Caesar was a genuinely brilliant observer, and partly because he was also a politician with a very specific audience in mind. He was writing for Rome. He was writing to justify his campaigns, to demonstrate his military genius, and to present the peoples he had conquered in a way that made his conquest seem necessary and impressive. To do that, he needed the Celts to be a certain kind of enemy, brave enough to be worthy opponents. Caesar was not interested in boasting about defeating a rabble, but also different enough, strange enough, that conquering them seemed like a civilizing act, a bringing of order to chaos, a bringing of light to darkness. So Caesar wrote about Celtic human sacrifice. He wrote about the Druids burning people alive inside giant wicker structures shaped like men, the famous wicker man. He wrote about society that was, in his telling, simultaneously impressive and horrifying, sophisticated enough to have priests and philosophers, but savage enough to demand blood. Now, how much of this was true? The honest answer is we do not know for certain. Caesar was not the only Roman writer to describe Celtic rituals, and there is some consistency across sources about certain practices. But there is also a very well-established pattern, documented by scholars who have studied this question carefully, of Roman writers borrowing descriptions from one another, embellishing details, and filtering everything through a lens that made Celtic practices look as alien and frightening as possible. The wicker man, for instance. Caesar describes it. Other writers repeat the description, but no one has ever found archaeological evidence of a wicker man structure being used for mass burning. What archaeologists have found in bog deposits and ritual sites across Celtic territory is something much more nuanced. Offerings. Sacrifices, yes, in some cases, but sacrifice understood in a very different way than the Romans presented it. Not as a spectacle of horror, but as an exchange. a gift given to the land, to the gods, to the invisible forces that sustained life, a gift that was sometimes, tragically, a human life, but embedded in a context of meaning and relationship that the Roman accounts strip away entirely. This is what happens when one civilization writes the history of another. The details that matter most to the people living the experience, the meaning, the context, the web of belief and obligation that surrounds any act, those details are the first things to be lost. What remains is the surface, the dramatic image, the thing that can be understood quickly and used to support a particular narrative. And the narrative the Romans built around the Celts was remarkably durable. It lasted for centuries. It shaped how medieval European scholars thought about the pre-Roman peoples of their continent. It shaped how Renaissance writers imagined the ancient world. It shaped, to a degree that is only now beginning to be fully understood, how we think about the Celts today. But here is the thing about durable narratives. They are durable precisely because they are simple. And simple stories, no matter how well told, always leave something out. The Romans left out the oral tradition. They left out the sacred landscapes. They left out the subtle architecture of shared power. They left out the philosophy. They left out the poetry. They left out everything that could not be seen from the outside, everything that lived in the silence between words, and everything that required years of patient listening to understand. They left out, in other words, almost everything that mattered most. Let the breath come slow now. We're moving into the deepest part of the story, the part where the threads begin to come together. Truth preserved through memory, through myth, through the long, patient act of telling and retelling, generation after generation, until the stories become so worn smooth by repetition that they feel less like stories and more like the shape of the world itself. This is what happened to Celtic knowledge after the Roman conquest. It did not disappear. It did not vanish into oblivion. It went underground. It went into the stories. It went into the poems and the songs and the seasonal rituals that communities continued to practice long after the Romans had built their roads and their forts and their temples across Celtic territory. The Romans could conquer the land. They could tax the people. They could impose their language, their laws, and their gods. But they could not reach into the memory of an elder sitting by a fire on a winter evening, telling a story to the children gathered around her. They could not silence the songs that were sung at the turning points of the year, at the moments when the sun reached its lowest point, or the harvest came in, or the first frost touched the fields. They could not erase the deep embodied knowledge that Celtic communities carried in their bodies, in their hands, and in their understanding of the land they lived on. And so, the knowledge survived, changed certainly, adapted undoubtedly, mixed with Roman customs and later with Christian beliefs as centuries passed, but surviving, persisting, holding its shape in the way that water holds its shape, flowing around obstacles, finding new channels, but never losing its essential nature. The Irish myths are perhaps the most extraordinary example of this survival. Written down beginning in the 7th and 8th centuries CE by monks in Irish monasteries, these myths preserve stories that scholars believe originated centuries earlier, some of them possibly in the pre-Roman period, carried forward through exactly the kind of oral tradition the Celts had always practiced. The monks who wrote them down did not always understand what they were preserving. They added Christian framing, reinterpreted pagan figures as historical kings, and softened some of the stranger and more unsettling elements. But the bones of the stories remained. The deep structure, the assumptions about how the world worked, about the relationship between people and land, and about the nature of power and obligation and the sacred. And when scholars began to read these myths not as simple entertainment, not as quaint folk tales, but as encoded repositories of an entire civilization's understanding of itself, that is when the real work of rediscovery began. Consider the Tuatha De Danann, one of the great mythological races in Irish tradition. They are described as beings of extraordinary beauty and power who came to Ireland in the distant past, bringing with them 4 treasures: a spear, a sword, a stone, and a cauldron. They ruled Ireland for a time before being displaced by another group, the Milesians, who are understood to represent the arrival of the historical Irish. But the Tuatha De Danann did not leave Ireland when they were displaced. They retreated into the hills, into the hollow mountains, into the fairy mounds, the Sid, which are in many cases real places in the Irish landscape. Real hills, real burial mounds, and real ancient sites that still exist today. Now, a modern scholar reading this myth casually might see a simple displacement narrative. One group arrives, another group leaves. The departing group becomes supernatural beings who live beneath the earth. Straightforward enough. But read it more carefully. Pay attention to the details. The Tuatha De Danann did not really leave. They went beneath the surface. They are still there, in the hills, in the land itself. And the myths are full of moments where the boundary between their world and the human world becomes permeable. At certain times of year, particularly at Samhain, the festival at the end of October that marked the Celtic New Year, the doors of the Sid open and the Tuatha De Danann can be seen. They can interact with humans. The worlds overlap. What is this, if not a mythological expression of the Celtic understanding that the land is alive, that the landscape contains layers of meaning and presence that go deeper than what the human eye can see, that the relationship between a people and their territory is not simply a matter of living on the land, but of living with it, alongside it, in a continuous conversation that spans generations and crosses boundaries that we, in our modern, rational framework, have convinced ourselves do not exist. The four treasures of the Tuatha De Danann have been the subject of scholarly analysis for over a century. Some researchers have connected them to ritual objects found in archaeological digs across Celtic territory. The cauldron in particular appears again and again in Celtic contexts, a vessel of abundance, of transformation, of communal gathering. The famous cauldron of Dagda, belonging to one of the great gods of Irish myth, is described as never being empty, as feeding the hungry, and as being large enough to hold the entire world. This is not simply a fairy tale detail. It is an expression of a value, a belief that abundance is not something to be hoarded, but something to be shared, that the purpose of power, of any kind of power, whether it belongs to a god or a king or a community, is to nourish. And this brings us back to the question of power, back to the quiet conspiracy at the heart of Celtic civilization. The conspiracy that was never really a conspiracy at all, but simply a way of organising human life that the Romans did not understand, and that our own civilization, with its emphasis on individual achievement and centralised authority, has largely forgotten. The night is deepening now. Let the words come to you like water, like the slow movement of a stream over smooth stones. There is no urgency here, no rush. The story will unfold at its own pace, the way it always has, the way it was always meant to. There is a place in County Clare, on the west coast of Ireland, called the Burren. It is one of the strangest landscapes in Europe. The ground is made almost entirely of limestone, pale grey and fractured into a maze of cracks and crevices called grikes, and between the grikes, in the thin soil that collects there, extraordinary flowers grow. Arctic plants and alpine plants and Mediterranean plants, all growing side by side because the microclimate created by the limestone is so unusual that species that would normally be separated by thousands of miles of latitude find themselves neighbours here. The Burren has been inhabited for a very long time, longer than most people realise. There are megalithic tombs here that date back over 5,000 years. Great stone structures built by people whose names we will never know, for purposes we can only guess at. And there are traces, in the landscape itself, of a relationship between humans and this strange, beautiful, inhospitable place that goes back even further than that. The Romans barely touched the Burren. It was too remote, too rocky, and too strange to bother conquering. And so it was left largely alone. And the people who lived there continued to live there in ways that had not changed enormously in a very long time. They continued to know the land the way their ancestors had known it, not as a map, not as a resource to be exploited, but as a living system of which they were a part. Walk through the Burren today in the early morning, when the light is coming in low and golden from the west, and you can feel something of what the Celts must have felt when they stood in their sacred places, a sense of being watched, not by anything hostile or frightening, but by something ancient and patient and vast, a sense that the land is aware of you in its own slow geological way, that it has been watching people walk across it for millennia, and that it will continue to watch long after you're gone. This is not mysticism, or rather it is mysticism only if you define mysticism as any experience that falls outside the narrow range of what modern Western rationality considers acceptable. The Celts would not have called it mysticism. They would have called it paying attention. They would have called it being present in a place, really present, with all your senses open and your assumptions quiet. And this is perhaps the deepest truth that the Celtic Conspiracies reveal. The deepest thing that was always there, waiting to be understood beneath the layers of Roman misinterpretation and centuries of cultural amnesia. The conspiracy was never about secrecy. It was about attention. Let us talk about the Druids one more time before we move on, because they deserve more than the caricature that history has handed them. The word Druid itself is debated among scholars. One common interpretation connects it to the Celtic words for oak and knowledge, suggesting something like oak knowledge, or wisdom of the oak. This may or may not be etymologically accurate, but it captures something true about the role these figures played in Celtic society. They were not priests in the way Romans understood priests. They were not simply intermediaries between gods and people, performing rituals in designated sacred spaces. They were scholars, teachers, judges, philosophers, healers, counsellors. The Romans, characteristically, tried to fit them into a Roman category and could not quite manage it. Caesar wrote that the Druids believed in the transmigration of souls, that after death the soul moved into a new body, whether human or animal, and began life again. This belief, if accurate, would have had profound implications for how Druids understood their relationship to the natural world. If you might one day inhabit the body of a deer or a fish or a tree, if the boundary between human and non-human was not fixed but fluid, then the idea of treating the natural world as a resource to be used and discarded would seem not just foolish, but genuinely dangerous. You might be destroying something that will one day house a part of yourself. Imagine what this belief would have meant in practice. Imagine walking through a forest and understanding, not as an abstract philosophical idea, but as a felt conviction that the deer watching you from between the trees might one day carry a soul that was once human, that the oak tree above you, ancient and gnarled and patient beyond all human reckoning, might be a resting place for a consciousness that once sat by a fire and told stories and loved someone. This kind of belief does not produce a casual relationship with the natural world. It produces reverence. It produces care. It produces the kind of deep, attentive relationship with the landscape that archaeologists have found traces of everywhere they have looked in Celtic territory. The forests the Celts lived in were not the kind of forests we think of today, managed, thinned, and domesticated by centuries of human intervention. They were old-growth forests, dense and dark and alive with a complexity that modern ecology is only beginning to understand. The canopy was so thick in places that the forest floor was perpetually dim, a world of green, shadow, and filtered light, where the air was cool and damp and smelled of moss and earth, and the slow, patient process of decay that feeds new growth. To move through such a forest was to move through something that felt, unmistakably, alive. Not alive in the way a person is alive, but alive in a deeper, slower, more ancient sense. Alive the way the earth itself is alive. The Celts knew this forest intimately. They knew which plants could heal and which could kill. They knew where the deer gathered in the early morning and where the salmon ran in autumn. They knew the cycles of the seasons with a precision that came not from observation alone, but from generations of accumulated knowledge, passed from parent to child, from elder to apprentice. in exactly the kind of living transmission that their oral tradition was designed to preserve. This is speculative, of course. We cannot know exactly what the Druids believed, because they did not write it down. But the belief in transmigration, combined with the Celtic reverence for sacred landscapes and the deep ecological knowledge that Celtic communities clearly possessed, knowledge of plants, of animals, and of the rhythms of the seasons that goes far beyond what casual observation could provide, all of this suggests a worldview in which humans were not masters of the earth, but participants in it. Not the rulers of nature, but one voice among many in an ongoing conversation. The Romans found this deeply unsettling. A worldview in which humans were not supreme, in which the land had its own authority, and in which power was not concentrated in human hands, but distributed throughout a living system. This challenged something fundamental about the Roman self-understanding. Rome was built on the idea of dominion, of conquest, of imposing human will upon the world. The Celtic way of seeing things, quiet, reciprocal, humble in its recognition of human limitation, was not just foreign to Rome. It was in some sense a rebuke. And so Rome did what empires have always done when they encounter a worldview that threatens their own. They dismissed it. They ridiculed it. They simplified it into something that could be safely ignored or safely conquered. They turned the Druids into exotic curiosities, or into frightening witch doctors performing bloody rituals in dark groves. Anything that would make the Celtic worldview seem less like a serious alternative to Roman civilization, and more like a quaint primitive aberration. But the Druids disappeared from the historical record not because they ceased to exist, but because the Romans stopped writing about them. After the conquest of Gaul, the Druids were suppressed. Their gatherings were banned, and their authority was undermined by the new Roman administrative structure. But suppression is not the same as destruction. The knowledge they carried did not vanish. It dispersed. It moved into the communities. It became part of the ordinary, everyday understanding that Celtic people carried with them as they went about their lives, growing food, raising animals, marking the seasons, and telling stories to their children by firelight. And centuries later, when scholars began to piece together what Celtic civilization had actually been like, not through the Roman accounts alone, but through the myths, the place names, the archaeological evidence, and the folklore that persisted in rural communities long after the official history had declared the Celts conquered and forgotten, they began to see the outlines of something that had never truly disappeared, something that had simply gone quiet, something that had been there all along, waiting in the silence, waiting in the land, waiting in the stories that grandmothers told their grandchildren on winter evenings when the fire was low and the wind was moving through the darkness outside. There is a phenomenon that linguists call substrate influence. It is the way in which a language that is replaced by another language, through conquest, migration, or cultural pressure, leaves traces of itself in the new language, words, phrases, and ways of expressing certain ideas that the conquering language did not have its own words for. These traces persist for centuries, sometimes millennia, long after the original language has ceased to be spoken. Celtic languages left extraordinary traces across Europe. The place names of Britain, France, and much of continental Europe are thick with Celtic roots. Rivers, hills, forests, towns, the names the Celts gave to these places persisted even after the Celtic languages themselves were replaced by Latin, and then by the various languages that evolved from Latin. The name of Paris comes from a Celtic tribal name. The name of the Rhine may have Celtic origins. Across the British Isles, the majority of ancient place names, the names of rivers especially, are Celtic in origin, predating the arrival of the Romans, the Anglo-Saxons, and the Vikings. These names are not simply labels. They are in many cases descriptions. Celtic place names often encode information about the character of a place, its landscape, its water, and its relationship to the surrounding terrain. They are in a sense a map made of language, a way of describing the world that preserves, in compressed and ancient form, the Celtic understanding of how places relate to each other and to the people who live among them. When you walk through the countryside of Wales or Ireland or Scotland, and you pay attention to the place names, the old names, the ones that predate the English language by centuries, you are walking through a landscape that is still, in some small but real way, Celtic. The names are still there. The knowledge encoded in them is still there, though it requires patience and scholarship to decode. The land remembers even when the people have forgotten. The night is very deep now. The world outside is quiet. Let yourself sink a little deeper into the stillness. We are coming to the end of our story, but not to an ending. That is an important distinction. The story of the Celts does not end. It does not conclude with a neat resolution or a final revelation. It simply opens up, like a landscape seen from a hilltop, into a vista that extends further than you can see. But let us stay with it a little longer. Let us follow the thread a little further into the quiet. The rediscovery of Celtic civilization, the slow, patient, painstaking work of scholars and archaeologists and linguists who have spent generations piecing together what Celtic life was actually like. This work is still ongoing. It is far from complete. There are vast gaps in our knowledge, and there probably always will be, because the Celts made a choice thousands of years ago not to write things down. They made a choice that meant their story would have to be reconstructed from fragments, from traces, from the things they left behind in the earth and the things they left behind in the stories that survived. But what has been reconstructed, even in its incomplete form, is enough to overturn some of the oldest and most persistent assumptions about ancient European civilization. It is enough to suggest that the Romans' account of the Celts was not history but propaganda. It is enough to suggest that the silence the Celts chose was not emptiness but fullness. It is enough to suggest that the way these people lived, quietly, attentively, in deep relationship with the land they inhabited, was not a primitive stage on the way to civilization, but a civilization in its own right, a different kind of civilization, one that valued different things, one that measured success not in conquests or monuments or written records, but in the health of the land, the strength of the community, and the depth of the relationship between a people and the place they called home. There is a tradition in Celtic storytelling, preserved in the Irish tales, of a place called Tir na Nog, the land of the young, a place beyond the western sea or beneath the hills, or somewhere just past the edge of the visible world, where time moves differently, where the land is always green, where there is no aging, no decay, no loss, where the people who find their way there live in a kind of eternal golden afternoon. Tir na Nog is not a place you can sail to on a map. It is not a lost continent or a forgotten island. It is, like so many things in Celtic mythology, a way of expressing something that cannot quite be captured in ordinary language. It is the feeling you get when you stand in a place of great beauty and great age, a place like the Burren, or the shores of a lake in the Scottish Highlands, or the ancient oak forests that once covered much of Europe, and you feel for a moment that time has stopped, that you're standing in a pocket of stillness in the midst of a world that is always moving, always changing, always rushing towards something. The Celts understood that feeling, they named it. They built stories around it. They made it part of their understanding of the world, not as an escape from reality, but as a recognition that reality contains more than what we normally see. That beneath the surface of things, beneath the daily rhythms of work and season and community, there is something older and quieter and more enduring, something that has been there since before the first human set foot on this land, and that will be there long after the last one has gone. There are people alive today who have felt something like this. Not in Ireland necessarily, though Ireland holds more of it than almost anywhere else in Europe, but in other places too. In the ancient forests of the Scottish Highlands, where the Caledonian pines stand sparse and weathered and impossibly old against a sky that seems wider than it should be. In the standing stones of Brittany, where great monoliths of granite rise from the earth in rows that stretch for miles, placed there by hands that knew something about the relationship between stone and sky that we have lost entirely. In the chalk hills of southern England, where the landscape is so smooth and so ancient that it seems less like land and more like the surface of a dreaming mind, these are places where time behaves differently, where the present moment seems to thin and something older and larger becomes visible beneath it. The Celts would not have been surprised by this experience. They would have nodded and said, "Yes, that is how it is. That is what the land does when you're quiet enough to notice. This is perhaps the final and deepest Celtic conspiracy. A conspiracy that was never a conspiracy at all. The idea that the world is more than it appears, that the land holds memory, that knowledge can live in places as well as in books. That power does not have to be loud to be real. That silence is not the absence of meaning, but one of its most profound expressions. The Romans built roads across Celtic territory, straight, efficient, purposeful roads that connected the centres of Roman power and made it easier to move armies and goods from one part of the empire to another. These roads are still visible in the landscape today in some places, remarkably well preserved given their age, monuments to Roman engineering and Roman will. But the Celtic paths, the older paths, the ones that wound through the landscape following the contours of the hills, and the courses of the rivers, and the ancient lines of travel between sacred sites. Those paths did not disappear either. They simply went quiet. They became footpaths, then barely visible trails, then nothing at all in most places. But in some places they persisted, in Ireland especially, where Roman conquest was never complete. The old paths continued to be walked, continued to connect the places that mattered, continued to carry people between the sacred sites and the seasonal gathering places and the ancient burial grounds that dotted the landscape like punctuation marks in a very long and very slow sentence. Walk one of these paths today, if you can find one. Walk it slowly, in the early morning or the late afternoon when the light is soft and the world is quiet. Pay attention to where it goes. Pay attention to what it connects. Pay attention to the way it moves through the landscape, not fighting the terrain, not cutting straight through it, but flowing with it, following the natural logic of the hills and the valleys and the water. You are walking on a path that someone walked 3,000 years ago, someone who understood this land in ways we have only begun to recover, someone who chose this route not because it was the fastest way from one place to another, but because it was the most meaningful, because it passed through places that mattered, because it connected points of significance in a web of relationships that stretched across the entire landscape. The path is still there. The knowledge it represents is still there, encoded in the curve of the route, in the places it touches, and in the way it moves through the world. It has been quiet for a very long time, but it has never stopped being walked. We are nearing the end of our journey tonight, but before we close, let us sit with one more image, one more moment of stillness. Somewhere in the west of Ireland, on a night in late October, thousands of years ago, a community gathered at the edge of a bog. The night was cold, that particular cold that comes in the Celtic twilight, when the last warmth of summer has finally left the air and the first real breath of winter touches your skin. The stars were beginning to appear, one by one, in a sky that was not yet fully dark. A great fire was being built, not for warmth alone, but for ceremony, for the marking of a boundary, the end of one year and the beginning of another. This was Samhain. The festival is at the turning point of the Celtic year, the night when the doors of the Cid opened, and the boundary between the living world and the world of the dead, the world of the ancestors, and the world of the Tuatha De Danann became thin enough to step through. People gathered from across the region, families who had not seen each other since the last great gathering, young people who had come of age over the summer, elders who carried the weight of memory and the responsibility of passing it on. The Druids, or whoever filled that role in this particular community, would have been present, guiding the ceremony, speaking the words that connected this night to all the Samhains that had come before it, stretching back into a past so deep that no single memory could hold it all. The smoke from the fire rose straight up into the still air, a dark column against the stars, carrying with it the scent of burning oak and heather and something older, earthier, the smell of peat that had been laid on the flames deliberately, connecting the fire to the land beneath it, to the bog that stretched away into the darkness beyond the circle of light. The children were quiet now, watching the flames with wide, serious eyes. They understood, even at their young age, that this was not an ordinary night, that something was happening that went beyond the warmth of the fire and the comfort of being gathered together with the people they loved. An elder spoke, not loudly. There was no need for loudness in a group this size, in a silence this complete. She spoke the names of the dead from the past year, each name spoken with care, with attention, with the weight that comes from knowing a person well and mourning their absence. And after each name, a pause, a moment of stillness in which the community collectively held the memory of that person, their face, their voice, their particular way of moving through the world, before letting it settle back into the silence from which it had been called. This was the work of Samhain. Not a celebration exactly, though there was joy in the gathering. Not mourning exactly, though there was grief in the remembering. It was something in between, something that the Celtic understanding of the world made room for in a way that later civilizations, with their sharper divisions between life and death, and between the sacred and the ordinary, would find difficult to accommodate. It was the acknowledgement that the dead were not gone, not entirely, that they were present in the land, in the stories and in the memories of the living, that the boundary between the world of the living and the world of the dead was not a wall but a membrane, permeable, thin enough on certain nights to feel. The fire burned, the stories were told. The names of the dead were spoken aloud so that they would not be forgotten, so that they would know they were remembered, and so that the connection between the living and the dead remained unbroken. Offerings were made to the bog, to the land, and to the invisible presences that the community understood to be part of their world, even though they could not be seen. And then, as the fire burned lower, and the night deepened, and the stars wheeled slowly overhead in their ancient patterns, the community began to disperse, back to their homes, their families, their daily lives, but carrying with them, as they always did, the knowledge that had been spoken and sung and shared that night, carrying it in their memories, in their bodies, in the way they understood the world and their place in it. No one wrote it down. No one needed to. This is how knowledge survives when it is not written on paper, not as a fixed thing, a monument, or a record that can be pointed to and said to be the truth, but as a living thing, moving from person to person, changing slightly with each telling, adapting to new circumstances and new understandings, but holding its essential shape, holding its core meaning, the way a river holds its essential character even as the water in it is constantly changing, constantly flowing through, and constantly being replaced by new water from new rain. The Celts understood this. They understood that knowledge is not a thing to be possessed, but a thing to be participated in. A conversation, not a monologue. A relationship, not a transaction. And they built their entire civilization on that understanding, quietly, patiently, without leaving the kind of dramatic monuments or written records that later civilizations would use to measure and judge them. They left something else instead. They left the land itself marked with the traces of their attention. They left the stories, worn smooth by centuries of retelling but still holding their shape. They left the place names, encoded with information about the character of the landscape. They left the paths, winding through the hills in patterns that reflect a deep understanding of how the world fits together. They left, in short, everything that matters, and nothing that does not. The conspiracies that were actually true. Let us gather them up gently before we let them go. The conspiracy of silence, the deliberate choice not to write, made not out of ignorance but out of a sophisticated understanding of how knowledge works best when it lives in living minds, rather than on dead pages. A choice that looked to the Romans like backwardness, but was actually a form of intellectual courage. A bet that the relationship between teacher and student, between elder and young person, and between story and listener was more valuable than any book. The conspiracy of the landscape, the careful, patient selection of sacred sites based not on military or economic logic, but on a felt sense of the land's own significance. A practice that the Romans dismissed as superstition, but that reflected a genuine and profound relationship between a people and the territory they inhabited. A relationship that was not simply about using the land, but about listening to it. The conspiracy of shared power, the intricate, invisible architecture of obligation and reciprocity that distributed authority so thoroughly that no single person could accumulate too much of it. A system that looked, from the outside, like chaos or the absence of leadership, but was actually one of the most sophisticated forms of social organization ever devised. A system built not on force, but on relationship. Not on conquest, but on consensus. The conspiracy of survival. The way Celtic knowledge persisted through centuries of Roman conquest and Christian conversion and cultural amnesia, not because it was hidden in secret, but because it was woven into the fabric of daily life, into the stories, into the seasonal rituals, into the names of places and the paths through the hills, and the deep embodied understanding that communities carried with them wherever they went. A survival that looked, to anyone not paying close attention, like disappearance. But it was actually something much more interesting, something much more quiet, something much more enduring. The fire is very low now. The night is at its deepest. Somewhere far away, on the other side of the world, the sun is rising over landscapes that the Celts never knew about. But here, in the darkness, in the stillness, the old knowledge is still present, not as a dramatic revelation, not as a secret finally uncovered after centuries of mystery, but as something that was always there, in the land and in the stories and in the way certain places still make you stop and breathe and pay attention, even if you could not explain why. The Celts did not need to write it down for it to be true. They did not need Rome's permission for it to matter. They did not need us to understand it in order for it to have shaped the world we live in. The knowledge persisted. The relationship persisted. The quiet, patient, enduring conversation between a people and their land persisted through conquest and conversion and the long, slow passage of centuries. It is still going on, right now. In the places where the old paths still wind through the hills, in the stories that grandmothers still tell without quite knowing where the stories came from, in the way that certain landscapes still hold something in them, some quality of attention, some sense of depth and presence, that reaches across thousands of years and touches something in us that is older than language. You do not need to go to Ireland to feel it. You do not need to stand on a Celtic hilltop or walk through an ancient bog. You simply need to be quiet enough and still enough and patient enough to notice what has always been there. The land remembers, the stories remember, and somewhere, in the long silence between one heartbeat and the next, the Celts are still speaking. Let the silence come now. Let it settle around you like snow, like mist, like the slow darkening of a sky at the end of a long autumn day. There is nothing left to say, and everything has been said. And both of these things are true at the same time. That is the Celtic way of it. That is the way of all the old knowledge that lived before the written word, and that will continue to live long after the last page has been turned. Sleep now. The land is quiet. The stories are resting. And somewhere, in the deep and ancient dark, the conversation continues. You are drifting back to a time when the Aegean Sea cradled hundreds of islands, and the people who lived there shaped their understanding of the world through story, stone, and the slow turning of seasons. Here, across warm waters and sunlit shores, memory and landscape became quietly inseparable, and the earth beneath their feet held stories that would echo for thousands of years. You wake before dawn in a small coastal settlement, where the first light touches whitewashed walls and the smell of the sea drifts through open doorways. Your neighbours are already moving, their footsteps soft on packed earth as they make their way toward the harbour. This is how most mornings begin. There is bread to bake, nets to mend, and boats to prepare. The rhythm is familiar, shaped by tides and weather, by the seasons that dictate when to plant and when to harvest. The island where you live is one of many scattered across the Aegean, each with its own character but all sharing the same dependence on the sea. Fishing provides much of what your community needs. Men and women work together to haul in the day's catch, sorting through silvery fish that will be salted, dried, or traded. Children help carry baskets, learning the work by watching and imitating. There is no rush, only the steady pace of hands that know their task well. Inland, farmers tend terraced fields where barley and lentils grow in soil enriched by centuries of careful cultivation. The terraces follow the contours of the hillside, each level supported by low stone walls built by hands that understood how to work with the land rather than against it. Olive trees dot the slopes. Their twisted trunks and silvery leaves are constant presence. Harvesting olives is a communal effort, families gathering to shake the branches and collect the fruit in woven baskets. The oil pressed from these olives will light lamps, flavour food, and serve as currency in trades with neighbouring islands. Trade itself is woven into the fabric of daily life. Small boats move between islands, carrying goods that each community produces in abundance. Pottery from one island is exchanged for wine from another. Obsidian, prized for its sharp edge, travels from volcanic islands to places where such stone is rare. Textiles woven from wool and dyed with plants or shellfish find their way into distant markets. These exchanges are not merely transactions, but relationships, bonds formed over shared meals and repeated visits that span generations. Your home is modest, built from stone and clay with a flat roof that can be used for drying fruit or sleeping on warm nights. Inside, storage jars hold grain, oil and water. A hearth anchors the central room, its fire tended carefully throughout the day. Cooking is simple but sufficient. Bread, fish, vegetables, cheese and fruit make up most meals. Honey sweetens special occasions. Wine, diluted with water, accompanies gatherings. Life moves in cycles you can anticipate. Spring brings planting and the return of migrating birds. Summer means long days of work under a bright sun, followed by evenings spent outdoors where breezes cool the air. Autumn is harvest time, when the fruits of the year's labour are gathered and stored. Winter brings quieter days, time for repair and craft, for weaving and tool-making, for the stories that hold your community's memory. Religious observance is part of this rhythm too, though it feels less like ceremony and more like acknowledgement. Small shrines dot the landscape, places where offerings are left to honour the forces that govern your world. A bit of grain poured onto the ground, a cup of wine spilled into the sea, flowers placed on a stone altar. These gestures are simple, a way of maintaining balance with the world around you. Neighbours know each other well. Disputes are settled through discussion, often with the guidance of elders whose experience commands respect. Celebrations mark births, marriages, and successful harvests. Music comes from simple instruments, flutes and drums that accompany singing and dancing. Children play games that teach cooperation and skill, running through narrow streets or along the shore where waves lap at the sand. The sea is always present, its moods familiar. Calm days allow for longer journeys. Rougher weather keeps boats close to shore. Storms are respected but not feared. Your ancestors learned to read the sky and water, to know when conditions favour travel and when it is wiser to wait. This knowledge passes from one generation to the next, carried in stories and observation, in the thousand small lessons that come from living close to something powerful yet predictable. Evenings often find you seated outside, watching the sun sink toward the horizon. The sky shifts through shades of orange and pink, then deepens to blue and finally to the soft darkness where stars emerge one by one. These moments feel timeless, as though your grandparents and their grandparents before them saw the same sky, felt the same breeze, and heard the same gentle sounds of a community settling into rest. This is the world you inhabit, unremarkable in its rhythms yet rich in the small comforts that steady hands and familiar routines provide. The land is generous when tended with care. The sea offers its bounty to those who respect its nature. And the people around you, bound by shared labour and shared seasons, form a web of support that makes life not just survivable, but quietly good. The islands of the Aegean rest on a foundation that is far older than human memory, shaped by forces that work on a timescale measured in thousands and millions of years. Beneath the blue waters and fertile slopes, the earth itself is slowly, constantly in motion. This movement is gentle on a human scale, nearly imperceptible in the span of a single lifetime, but over long ages it has built mountains, opened seas, and created the very ground you walk upon. Your island, like many others in the Aegean, owes its existence to volcanic activity. Deep below the surface, molten rock rises from the Earth's interior, finding pathways through cracks and weaknesses in the crust. When this molten material reaches the surface, it cools and solidifies, layer upon layer, gradually building cones and ridges that eventually break through the sea to become islands. The process is not rapid. It happens in increments, in eruptions separated by decades or centuries, each one adding to what came before. The soil you farm is a gift from these volcanic origins. Ash and weathered lava break down over time into rich, dark earth that holds moisture and nutrients well. This fertility is why your ancestors chose to settle here, why they cleared terraces and planted crops that thrived in soil that seemed almost generous in what it could produce. The volcanic minerals feed the olive trees and grapevines, giving their fruit a quality that traders recognize and value. Not all the islands share the same story. Some are limestone built from ancient seabeds lifted slowly above the water. Others are a mix, volcanic cores surrounded by sedimentary layers deposited when the sea covered what is now land. These differences show in the landscape. Limestone islands often have caves and underground streams, their rock dissolving slowly in rainwater. Volcanic islands tend towards steeper slopes and darker stone, their surfaces newer in geological terms. The Aegean itself is a young sea, carved out as tectonic plates shifted and pulled apart. Where the African plate pushes northward against the Eurasian plate, the Earth responds by folding, faulting, and occasionally releasing tension through earthquakes. These tremors are part of life here, noticed but not dwelled upon. A shaking that rattles cups and sends people outdoors for a moment, then passes. Buildings are constructed with this in mind, walls thick and low, designed to flex rather than shatter. Volcanic islands sometimes show signs of their fiery origins in ways that are visible on the surface. Hot springs bubble up in certain locations, their water carrying minerals that leave colourful deposits on the surrounding rock. Steam vents release warmth into the air. These features are considered useful, even beneficial. The hot water soothes aches and is thought to have healing properties. The warmth from vents can be harnessed for cooking or keeping spaces comfortable during cooler months. Coastlines are not fixed. Over generations they shift in response to the sea's persistent work. Waves carve into softer rock, creating coves and beaches. Sediment carried by rivers and streams accumulates in sheltered bays, gradually extending the land. Cliffs erode, their material tumbling into the water and eventually becoming sand. Harbours that once offered deep anchorage may silt up, requiring communities to adapt, to build in new locations or dredge channels to maintain access. The seafloor itself holds remnants of past landscapes. Pottery shards and stone anchors rest on submerged shelves that were once dry land, drowned when sea levels rose as ice sheets melted at the end of colder periods. These changes happened gradually, over centuries, giving people time to move upslope, to resettle, and to adjust. The stories of those older settlements fade but do not disappear entirely, preserved in fragments and in the collective memory of where ancestors once lived. Islands also rise and fall, though the movement is slow. Tectonic forces can lift sections of the coast, leaving ancient beaches perched above the current shoreline. Other areas subside, sinking gradually so that structures built at the water's edge eventually stand in shallow water. These shifts are noticed when old markers no longer align with the present landscape, when a stone that once sat well above the tide now feels the sea's reach. The volcanic character of the region means that some islands have craters, broad depressions where the centre of the volcano has collapsed inward. These calderas can fill with water, creating sheltered harbours or lakes. The process of collapse is not sudden from a human perspective. It occurs over many eruptions as magma chambers empty and the ground above slowly settles into the space left behind. By the time you see a caldera, it is already ancient, its formation complete long before your community's memory. This landscape, varied and slowly shifting, provides the stage for human life. The same forces that create rich soil and sheltered bays also shape the stories people tell about the world. When the earth shakes, when steam rises from a fissure, when a distant island changes shape over the course of generations, these events become woven into the fabric of understanding. They are explained, remembered, and passed down, not as mysteries, but as parts of the natural order that deserve respect and attention. Stories are the threads that connect one generation to the next, carrying forward what matters most about how the world works and where your community comes from. In a culture without written records, memory is shared through telling and retelling, through the rhythm of repeated phrases and the structure of narratives that make information easier to hold and pass along. This is how knowledge survives, how the past remains present, and how explanations for unusual events take shape and endure. You grow up hearing these stories. They come in the evenings, when work is done, and people gather in the fading light. Elders speak, and younger listeners absorb not just the words, but the patterns, the ways of describing and explaining that make sense of the world. Some stories are about ancestors, about the founding of your settlement, or the first person to plant an olive tree on this particular hillside. Others explain natural phenomena, offering frameworks for understanding why the earth shakes, why some years bring more rain than others, why certain islands have features that others lack. These narratives are not rigid. Each telling can shift slightly depending on the teller, the audience, and the circumstances. Details are added or subtracted, emphasis moves, and new observations are woven in. This flexibility allows the story to stay relevant and to adapt to what the community knows and needs. Yet the core remains stable, held in place by the structure itself, by phrases that are repeated the same way each time, and by sequences of events that follow a familiar order. When something unusual happens, the community works to make sense of it. An earthquake that is stronger than most, a change in the shape of a nearby island, a particularly vivid sunset that paints the sky in unfamiliar colours. These events are discussed compared to past occurrences, fitted into the framework of what is already understood. Over time, the most striking events become part of the communal memory, shaped into narratives that explain what happened and why it mattered. The process is collaborative. Multiple voices contribute, each adding perspective. Someone remembers a similar event from their childhood. Another recalls what their grandparents said about an even older occurrence. Details are debated, consensus is reached, and gradually a version emerges that satisfies the need for explanation. This version is then repeated and refined through telling, until it settles into a form that can be remembered and passed on. Symbols and imagery help carry these memories. A great wave is described in terms that evoke its size and power, without needing to recount every specific detail. A volcanic eruption might be remembered through the colour of the sky, the smell of the air, and the way ash settled on rooftops. These sensory markers anchor the story, making it vivid enough to stay in memory across years and generations. Geography plays a role in what is remembered. Islands that are visible from your shore are part of your daily experience, and changes to those islands are noticed and remarked upon. More distant places, known only through the accounts of travellers and traders, exist in memory differently. They are real but less immediate, their stories filtered through second-hand tellings. When such places undergo significant change, the news arrives gradually, carried by those who witnessed it or heard about it from others who did. Trade routes spread stories just as they spread goods. A trader from another island brings news of an event, a description of something unusual. This account is shared with your community, compared to what you already know, and incorporated into your understanding. Over time, stories can travel far from their origins, changing shape as they pass through different languages and cultural contexts, but retaining enough of their essence that a trace of the original event remains. Religious and ritual contexts also preserve memory. Certain stories are told as part of seasonal observances or ceremonies that mark important moments in the community's life. These ritual tellings add weight to the narrative, embedding it in a framework that is repeated regularly. The repetition ensures that the story does not fade, that each new generation hears it and learns to tell it themselves. Not every event is remembered equally. Some fade quickly, too ordinary or too small to warrant retelling. Others persist because they touch something fundamental, because they challenged assumptions or required explanation, because they were witnessed by many and discussed widely. The events that endure in memory are those that mattered, that shaped how people understood their world or altered the landscape in ways that could not be ignored. The line between history and myth is not always clear. Over generations, the details of an actual event can become embellished, simplified, or combined with elements from other stories. A flood that displaced communities might be remembered as a great inundation, its causes attributed to divine action, or cosmic shifts rather than the specific geological processes that triggered it. This transformation is not a failure of memory, but a reflection of how oral tradition works, preserving the impact of an event even as the precise mechanisms fade into the background. Your role as a listener is to receive these stories, to hold them in your own memory so that you can pass them on when the time comes. You learn to recognize the patterns, to understand when a story is being told for instruction and when it is being shared for reflection. You notice how certain tales are told to children to teach them about safety or respect for the natural world, while others are shared among adults who can appreciate the complexity and nuance. This web of shared memory creates continuity. It ties your community to the land and sea, to the events that shaped both, and to the understanding that what you experience now is part of a longer story. The earth shifts, the sea changes, and people adapt. These truths are held in the stories you carry, in the knowledge that is given freely and received with care, in the ongoing conversation between past and present that defines who you are. Life in the Aegean is shaped not only by work, but also by the patterns of rest that allow you to sustain effort over time. These rhythms are as essential as the labour itself, providing structure to your days and marking the transitions between seasons, between periods of intensity and periods of ease. Midday rest is a practice woven into the fabric of daily routine. As the sun climbs and the heat intensifies, activity slows. Fields are left, boats secured, and people retreat to shaded spaces or the cool interiors of their homes. This pause is not laziness, but wisdom, a recognition that the hottest hours are better spent conserving energy than expending it. You rest, sometimes sleeping, sometimes simply sitting in stillness, while the world outside shimmers with heat. During these quiet hours, the landscape itself seems to pause. Animals seek shade, birds are less vocal. The sea reflects the sky in a smooth, glassy surface. This is a time that feels suspended, as though the day is holding its breath before resuming. When the temperature begins to drop and the light softens, activity resumes gradually, with people emerging to complete tasks or begin new ones with the benefit of cooler air. Evenings offer a different kind of rest, communal and reflective. As work ends, you gather with neighbours, sharing simple meals or sitting together while children play nearby. Conversations meander, touching on the events of the day, plans for tomorrow, and observations about weather or crops. There is no urgency, only the gentle exchange of thoughts and presence. Nighttime brings a deeper rest, the kind that allows the body to recover and the mind to process the accumulation of experience. You sleep on woven mats or simple beds, the air moving through open windows or doorways. In warmer months, some people sleep on rooftops, where breezes carry the scent of the sea and the sky stretches overhead, vast and filled with stars. This practice turns sleep into a connection with the larger world, a reminder that you are part of something greater than the confines of walls and daily tasks. The rhythm of the year also includes longer periods of rest. After harvest, when the work of gathering and storing is complete, there is time to repair, to create, and to engage in projects that cannot be pursued during busier seasons. This is when new tools are made, when textiles are woven, and when attention can be given to crafts that require patience and focus. The pace is slower, the pressure lessened, and this interval allows you to approach the next cycle of planting and growth with renewed energy. Festivals and communal celebrations punctuate the year, serving as both rest and renewal. These gatherings interrupt the routine, offering time for music, dancing, feasting, and the kinds of interactions that strengthen bonds between people. Preparations for a festival are themselves a form of rest from regular labour, a shift in focus that feels lighter even as it requires effort. The celebration itself is a release, a collective exhaling that marks the passage of time and the continuation of community. Rest is also found in the small pauses throughout the day, a moment to watch the sea, to notice the play of light on water, a brief stop to greet a neighbour, to exchange a few words that carry warmth and recognition. These intervals are not planned but arise naturally, and they serve to break the monotony of repetitive tasks, to remind you that life is not only about accomplishment, but also about presence. Sleep, too, varies with the seasons. Longer winter nights offer extended rest, a gift of darkness that allows the body to recover from the exertions of the year. Summer nights are shorter, but often broken by the need to tend to animals or to check on drying crops. Even so, the total amount of rest balances over time, the body adjusting to the demands and opportunities of each season. Children learn these rhythms by living within them, observing when adults pause and understanding that rest is part of the natural order. They nap when tired, play when energized, and absorb the knowledge that there is a time for everything. This education is subtle, delivered not through instruction, but through the simple act of participating in a community that values rest as much as it values work. Even in times of change, when the land shifts or the sea behaves unexpectedly, the rhythms of rest persist. After an earthquake, once the immediate response is complete and safety is confirmed, people return to their beds. After a storm passes and the damage is assessed, routines resume. This continuity is reassuring, a signal that while individual events may disrupt, the larger patterns of life remain intact. Rest also carries a spiritual dimension, though it is not always articulated as such. In pausing, in allowing time for stillness and reflection, you create space for a different kind of awareness. The world reveals itself in these quiet moments, not through dramatic revelation, but through the accumulation of small observations. The way light changes as the sun sets, the sound of waves meeting the shore in a steady, unchanging rhythm, the coolness of stone under your hand as you lean against a wall, breathing slowly and feeling the day settle around you. These rhythms of rest, daily and seasonal, provide the scaffolding that supports all other aspects of life. Without them, the work would become unsustainable, the community would fray, and the connection to the land and sea would weaken. But with them, life finds balance, moving between effort and ease, between action and stillness, in a pattern that has sustained your people for as long as memory holds. The Aegean Sea is not a barrier, but a pathway, a network of routes that connects island to island and coast to coast. The water that surrounds you is familiar territory, its moods and rhythms as well known as the land itself. Fishermen navigate by landmarks, by the shape of distant hills, and the position of the sun, by knowledge passed down through countless voyages. The sea is where livelihoods are earned, and where relationships with other communities are built and maintained. Trade is the lifeblood of this interconnected world. Your island produces certain things in abundance, olives and oil perhaps, or pottery shaped from local clay. Other islands have their own specialties, wine, grain, or woven textiles dyed in colours specific to their region. These goods move across the water in small boats, carried by traders who know the routes and the people at each destination. The exchanges are personal, built on trust and the expectation of reciprocity. You give what you have in surplus, and you receive what you lack, and the relationship continues year after year. Harbours serve as gathering points, places where boats arrive and depart, where news is shared and plans are made. These spaces are busy but not chaotic, organised by the routines that govern loading and unloading, by the customs that dictate when and how transactions occur. Traders know each other, greet each other by name, inquire after families and conditions on other islands. The harbour is where the wider world touches your daily life, where the Aegean reveals itself as a community of communities rather than a collection of isolated settlements. Navigation relies on observation and experience. Sailors learn to read the sea, to recognise currents and wind patterns, and to understand how weather systems move across the region. Certain times of year are more favourable for long journeys, when winds blow steadily from predictable directions and storms are less frequent. Other periods call for caution, for staying closer to shore and being prepared to shelter if conditions change. This knowledge is practical and essential, the difference between safe passage and unnecessary risk. Islands are not uniform in their resources or their geography, and this variation drives trade. An island with good harbours but limited farmland imports grain. Another with abundant timber exports wood for boat building and construction. Obsidian from volcanic islands travels widely, valued for tools and weapons. Salt, fish and preserved foods move from coastal settlements to inland regions. Each exchange strengthens the network, creating interdependence that benefits all participants. Cultural exchange accompanies the movement of goods. Traders carry stories, songs and techniques from one place to another. A method of weaving learned on one island is shared and adapted by artisans elsewhere. A musical instrument becomes popular across the region. Religious practices and symbols spread, sometimes merging with local traditions to create new forms of expression. This flow of ideas is gradual but persistent, a quiet blending that enriches each community without erasing its distinct character. The boats themselves are practical vessels, designed for the specific conditions of the Aegean. They are small enough to be handled by a few people, but sturdy enough to manage open water. Construction methods are refined over generations, each builder learning from those who came before and contributing their own improvements. Sails are woven from plant fibres, and oars are shaped from wood that balances strength and flexibility. Repairs are made as needed, a constant process of maintenance that keeps the fleet functional. Fishing and trading often overlap. A boat that goes out for fish may also carry goods to exchange at a nearby island. The return journey brings back what was acquired, along with a fresh catch. This efficiency is typical of a culture that values resourcefulness, where every trip serves multiple purposes and nothing is wasted. Time on the water is used well, and the relationships formed through these repeated interactions become as valuable as the goods being traded. Seasonal patterns affect trade routes. Certain products are only available at specific times of year, and traders plan their journeys accordingly. Olive oil is pressed after the autumn harvest, and boats carry it to markets while the supply is fresh. Grain moves after the summer harvest. Wine ferments through the fall and winter, ready for transport in spring. These cycles create predictable rhythms, a calendar of exchange that structures the year. Shared festivals and gatherings bring people from multiple islands together, creating opportunities for trade but also for celebration and connection. These events are anticipated, prepared for with care, and enjoyed as communal experiences that reinforce the bonds between settlements. Goods change hands, yes, but so do stories, friendships, and the sense of belonging to something larger than a single island or household. The sea also serves as a source of shared identity. People who live on islands understand the water in ways that those on the mainland do not. They know its gifts and its demands, its capacity for both abundance and challenge. This understanding creates a common ground, a basis for mutual respect and cooperation. When you meet someone from another island, there is recognition, an immediate sense of kinship that comes from navigating the same waters and depending on the same currents. Pirates and raiders exist, but they are not the defining feature of sea travel. Most journeys are peaceful, encounters are friendly, and the expectation is cooperation rather than conflict. When problems arise, they are dealt with through negotiation and community response. The network of islands functions best when trust is maintained, and most people have a stake in preserving that trust. Trade also carries risk. Weather can turn unexpectedly, boats can be damaged, and goods can be lost. These risks are managed through experience and caution, through choosing routes carefully and paying attention to signs. Losses occur, but they are absorbed by the community, shared among those who participate in the network. No single failure is catastrophic because the system itself is resilient, built on many connections rather than relying on just a few. The movement of people accompanies the movement of goods. Families sometimes relocate to other islands, seeking new opportunities or joining relatives. Marriages connect communities, creating ties that span the water. Craftspeople travel to learn new techniques or to find markets for their work. This mobility is accepted, even encouraged, as part of what keeps the region vibrant and adaptable. In all of this, the sea remains central, the medium through which connection happens. Its presence is constant, its character familiar, and the life built around it reflects an understanding that isolation is not desirable or sustainable. The Aegean is a world of relationships, of exchanges and interactions that create a fabric of shared existence. Trade is the practical expression of that, but the deeper reality is community, the knowledge that you are not alone, that others face the same challenges and share the same hopes, and that the sea, vast and ever-present, ties you all together. When the sun dips below the horizon and the day's work is complete, a different kind of time begins. Evenings are for gathering, for the quiet conversations and storytelling that knit the community together. This is when the past becomes present, when memories are shared and the accumulated wisdom of generations is passed along. You settle into a familiar spot, perhaps on a low wall or a bench worn smooth by years of use. Others join, arriving in twos and threes, their faces lit by the last of the daylight and then by the glow of oil lamps or the small fire that someone has kindled. The transition from day to evening is gradual, marked not by abrupt change but by the gentle shift in light and temperature, by the way voices soften and the pace of movement slowing. Stories emerge naturally from conversation. Someone mentions a task completed or a challenge faced, and this reminds another of a similar situation from years ago. The memory is shared, details offered, and soon the group is engaged in a collective recollection. These stories are not grand narratives, but the small histories that make up daily life, the lessons learned from experience and the patterns noticed over time. Elders are central to this process. Their years have given them a depth of knowledge that younger people respect and seek out. When an elder speaks, others listen, not out of obligation, but because what is being offered has value. The elder's memory reaches back further, connecting the present to times that others can only know through these accounts. Events that happened decades ago are described. Places that have changed are recalled as they once were, and through this sharing, the continuity of the community is reinforced. The stories are not limited to human affairs. Much of what is shared concerns the natural world, the observations that help explain how things work, the behaviour of animals, the patterns of weather, and the cycles of growth and dormancy. These topics are endlessly interesting because they are endlessly relevant. Understanding the world around you is survival, but it is also satisfaction, the pleasure of seeing connections and making sense of what you observe. Volcanic activity and earthquakes find their way into these evening conversations not as sources of fear but as subjects of explanation. Someone describes an earthquake from their childhood, how the ground moved and what happened afterward. Another recalls seeing smoke rise from a distant island, the way the sky looked for days following. These accounts are measured, factual in tone, and focused on what was noticed and how the community responded. The emphasis is on adaptation, on the ways people adjusted and continued. The language used in storytelling has a rhythm to it, a cadence that makes the narratives easier to remember and repeat. Certain phrases recur, markers that signal familiar territory, a description of the sea's colour, the way ash smells, the sound of stones settling after a tremor. These details anchor the story, giving it texture and making it vivid enough to persist in memory. When you hear a story told multiple times, you begin to recognise these elements, and they become part of your own internal library of images and sensations. Children are present at these gatherings, absorbing what is said even when they do not fully understand it. They learn by listening, by watching how stories are told, and how adults engage with the past. Some stories are directed specifically at them, simplified and shaped to teach particular lessons. Others are for the whole group, and children glean what they can, their understanding deepening as they grow and hear the same stories again in different contexts. Reflection is as important as the stories themselves. After a narrative is shared, there is often a pause, a space where people consider what was said. Someone might add a detail, or offer a different perspective, or simply sit with the information and let it settle. This quietness is valued, a recognition that meaning is not always immediate, that understanding can deepen in the silence following words. Humour appears in these gatherings, gentle and warm. Someone makes an observation about human nature, a wry comment on the predictability of certain behaviours, or the irony of situations that repeat across generations. Laughter is soft, more a shared acknowledgement than a loud release. It serves to lighten the mood without diminishing the substance of what is being discussed. The physical setting contributes to the atmosphere. The evening air is cooler, a relief after the heat of the day. The sky darkens gradually, stars appearing one by one until the dome above is filled with light. The sea is audible, a steady backdrop of waves meeting the shore. These sensory elements create a context that feels safe and conducive to openness, to the kind of sharing that happens when people are relaxed and comfortable. Memory itself is a topic of reflection. People discuss how certain events are remembered and why some details persist while others fade. There is an awareness that memory is not perfect, that it shifts and is shaped by retelling, but there is also confidence in the collective nature of the process. What one person forgets, another remembers. Discrepancies are noted and discussed, and a version emerges that the group can accept as close enough to what happened. These evening gatherings serve multiple purposes. They educate, preserving knowledge that is essential for navigating the world. They entertain, providing enjoyment and the pleasure of narrative. They connect, strengthening the bonds between individuals and reinforcing the sense of shared identity. And they comfort, offering the reassurance that comes from continuity, from knowing that you are part of a lineage that stretches back and will continue forward. As the evening deepens, the conversation eventually winds down. People begin to drift away, heading to their homes and the rest that awaits. The fire, if there was one, burns low. The lamps are extinguished or carried inside. The gathering dissolves, but the stories linger, held in the minds of those who heard them, ready to be recalled and shared again when the next evening comes. Night settles over the Aegean with a gentle completeness. The last light fades from the western sky, and darkness becomes a presence that wraps around the island, softening edges and quieting sounds. This is the time when rest deepens, when the world pauses in a way that feels both familiar and timeless. You lie on your sleeping mat, the fabric cool against your skin. Through the open doorway or window, you can see a slice of sky, stars bright and clear in the absence of competing light. The moon, if it is visible, casts a pale glow that touches rooftops and the surface of the sea, creating a landscape rendered in shades of silver and shadow. This light is enough to navigate by if needed, but mostly it serves as a gentle presence, a reminder that even in darkness, the world is not empty. The sounds of night are subtle. The sea continues its rhythm, waves arriving and retreating in a pattern that requires no attention, yet provides a constant, soothing background. Occasionally a night bird calls, or the breeze stirs through the olive trees with a rustling whisper. These sounds are part of the fabric of nighttime, familiar and unremarkable, but together they create an atmosphere of calm. Sleep comes easily after a day of physical work. Your body, tired in the way that comes from useful effort, relaxes fully. Breathing slows, thoughts drift, and consciousness gradually releases its grip on the details of the day. Dreams may come, sometimes vivid, sometimes vague, but they are just another part of the night's experience, neither significant nor troubling. For those who remain awake, nighttime offers a different quality of awareness. Fishermen who work at night move quietly, preparing nets and boats with practiced efficiency. Their work is focused and deliberate, shaped by the need to be ready when the time is right to launch. Night fishing has its own rewards, certain species more easily caught in darkness, and the men who pursue this work know the rhythms and the techniques that make it successful. Watchfulness is part of nighttime culture, though it is not anxious or fearful. Someone might check on livestock, ensuring that animals are secure. Another might walk the perimeter of the settlement, a casual patrol that confirms all is well. These actions are habitual, a way of maintaining order without needing to articulate the reasons. The community functions on these small acts of care, repeated so often that they become automatic. Children sleep deeply, their rest untroubled. Their bodies, still growing, require long hours of sleep, and they give themselves over to it completely. Parents listen for sounds that might indicate distress, but mostly they trust that all is well, that the night is safe, and their children are protected within it. This trust is not blind but earned, based on countless nights that have passed without incident. The stars overhead have their own significance. They mark the passage of seasons, certain constellations appearing at specific times of year. Sailors use them for navigation, but even those who do not venture far from shore know the major patterns, the clusters and shapes that have names and stories attached. The stars are constant in a way that the changing landscape of the earth is not, and this constancy is comforting. Occasionally the night sky offers something unusual. A meteor streaks across the darkness, bright and brief. A planet shines with a steadier light than the stars. These phenomena are noticed and remarked upon, but they do not inspire dread. They are parts of the natural world, events that happen on their own schedule, and while they are interesting, they do not disrupt the fundamental sense of order. The moon cycle is tracked, its phases noted because they affect tides and light. A full moon provides enough illumination for certain activities, allowing work to extend into the evening. A new moon brings darker nights, but also the brilliance of stars undiminished by reflected light. Each phase has its character, and people adjust their routines accordingly. Night is also when the land seems to breathe differently. The heat of the day dissipates, and coolness rises from the ground. Dew forms on leaves and grass, small droplets that catch the moonlight. The air smells different, cleaner somehow, less layered with the sense of human activity. This freshness is one of night's quiet gifts, a renewal that happens without fanfare. For some, nighttime is a period of reflection. Lying awake in the darkness, thoughts wander to questions and considerations that the busyness of the day does not allow. These are not worries but contemplations, the mind turning over ideas at its own pace. Solutions to problems sometimes arrive in these quiet hours, insights emerging when the usual distractions are absent. The continuity of night to night is part of what makes life feel stable. Each evening the sun sets, each morning it rises, and in between there is this interval of rest and quiet. The reliability of this cycle is foundational, a rhythm that does not change even when other things do. Earthquakes happen, weather varies, but night still comes, and with it the opportunity to rest. Sleep itself is seen as restorative, a necessary part of maintaining health and balance. Communities value rest, understanding that without it, people become less capable and less resilient. The practice of retiring early and rising with the sun is not enforced by rule, but by the natural alignment of human biology with the available light. There is no reason to burn oil unnecessarily, and the darkness invites sleep in a way that feels right. The transition from night to morning is gradual. The sky begins to lighten almost imperceptibly, a shift from black to deep blue. Birds start to sing, their calls announcing the coming day. People wake, stretching and preparing to begin again. The night has done its work, providing rest and continuity, and now it steps aside for the activity and warmth of a new day. This nightly rhythm, repeated endlessly, is one of the most fundamental aspects of existence. It requires no maintenance, no effort, yet it shapes everything. In its constancy, night offers a kind of reassurance, a guarantee that no matter what happens during the daylight hours, there will be this return to calm, this opportunity to lay down the day's concerns and simply be. The years turn, each one adding to the layers of experience and memory that make up your community's understanding of the world. Events happen, some ordinary and some unusual, but all are integrated into the ongoing story of life in the Aegean. The landscape shifts slowly, almost imperceptibly within a single lifetime, yet over generations the changes accumulate and become part of what is known and remembered. Volcanic islands sometimes alter their appearance. A vent that was active becomes dormant. A crater fills with rainwater and transforms into a lake. New land emerges from the sea after an eruption, cooling and solidifying until it is firm enough to walk on, though it may take decades before anything grows there. These changes are noticed and incorporated into the mental maps that people carry, adjustments made to reflect the current state of the geography. When such changes are significant enough to affect daily life, they enter the realm of shared memory. A harbour that silts up and becomes unusable is remembered, the story of its decline told so that future generations understand why a particular bay is no longer suitable for anchorage. An earthquake that alters the coastline is recalled in terms of the landmarks that shifted, the stone that tumbled, the way people adapted by building in new locations or reinforcing structures differently. The process of turning an event into memory is gradual. Immediate experience is vivid but chaotic, filled with details that may or may not matter in the long run. As time passes, the memory is refined. What seemed important in the moment may fade, while other aspects gain significance through reflection and discussion. The community collectively decides what is worth preserving, and the story that emerges is shaped by this consensus. In some cases, events from different times or places become conflated. A great flood remembered from one generation is merged with a similar event from another, creating a single narrative that represents both. This is not deception, but the natural working of memory, which organizes information by pattern and theme rather than by strict chronology. The resulting story may not be historically precise, but it captures the truth of what such events mean, how they feel, and how people respond. Geological processes that unfold over centuries are harder to track, but their effects are still noted. Coastlines that gradually submerge, leaving old structures partially underwater, become subjects of speculation and narrative. Why did the sea rise? What caused the land to sink? The answers provided may invoke divine action or cosmic shifts, frameworks that make sense within the cultural context even if they do not align with the actual mechanisms. What matters is that the community has an explanation, something that allows them to understand their world as coherent and meaningful. The idea of Atlantis, though you would not know it by that name, begins to take shape in this way. Somewhere in the collective memory of the Aegean, there are stories of islands that change dramatically, of prosperous settlements that were disrupted by natural forces, and of landscapes that were transformed in ways that seemed almost beyond belief. These stories travel, passing from one community to another, blending with other narratives, acquiring details and symbolic weight as they go. By the time such a story reaches a distant place, far from its origin, it has been reshaped many times, the specific details of which island and when have become less clear, but the core idea remains. There was a place, advanced and prosperous, that met with sudden transformation. The story serves as a reflection on impermanence, on the power of nature, on the limits of human control. It is not primarily a historical record, but a narrative that carries meaning, a way of articulating truths about existence that are felt deeply, even if not always spoken directly. You do not know that this story will one day be recorded in texts, that philosophers and historians will debate its origins, or that people in distant times will search for the physical location of Atlantis. For you, it is simply part of the fabric of memory, one story among many that help explain the world. The connection to Santorini, to the eruption that dramatically altered that island's shape, is there in the layers of memory, but it is not isolated or singular. It is woven together with other events, other islands, and other moments when the Earth demonstrated its capacity for change. This weaving is what memory does. It creates continuity not by preserving every detail with perfect accuracy, but by holding on to what matters, by finding patterns and meanings that transcend individual events. The stories that survive are those that serve the community, that teach, that explain, that provide comfort or caution. They are tools for making sense of a world that is dynamic and sometimes unpredictable, yet also reliable and knowable in its broader patterns. As you age, you become one of the carriers of this memory. The stories you heard as a child are now yours to tell, and you notice how your own telling has shifted slightly from what you remember hearing. This is expected, even necessary. Each generation adds its perspective and its experiences, and the story evolves without losing its essence. The process is collaborative and continuous, a conversation across time that does not end. The land and sea continue their slow work. Islands rise and fall, coasts erode and build, and volcanic vents open and close. Life adapts to these changes. Communities relocate or rebuild, and the memory of what was sustains them through the transitions. There is no final state, only an ongoing process, and within that process is the steady rhythm of human presence, observing, adapting, and remembering. The night sky, unchanged in its essential pattern, serves as a constant reference point. The stars you see are the same stars your ancestors saw, and this continuity is profound. It connects you to the past in a way that is direct and visceral, a reminder that while the earth beneath you shifts, some things remain. This balance between change and constancy is what allows life to continue, what makes adaptation possible without loss of identity. The stories you tell, the memories you hold, are part of this same balance. They anchor you to the past while allowing flexibility for the present. They provide context without dictating exact responses. They are living things, sustained through use, through the care taken in telling and listening, through the recognition that what is passed down has value that transcends the moment. In the end, the geomythology of the Santorini eruption and the story of Atlantis is not about destruction or loss, but about memory and meaning. It is about how communities understand and explain the changes they witness, and how they integrate dramatic events into the ongoing narrative of existence. The eruption, when it happened, was a geological event, a release of energy and material that reshaped the island. But over time it became something more, a touchstone in the collective memory, a symbol of transformation that carried lessons and reflections forward through the generations. You rest now, your thoughts settling as the day fades completely into night. The sea is calm, the stars are bright, and the land beneath you is ancient and enduring. Tomorrow will come with its routines and its surprises, and you will meet it with the knowledge and resilience that have been passed down to you. The story continues, as it always has, woven from memory and experience, from land and sea, from the quiet continuity that defines life in the Aegean.